let's imagine that we have a poet who wants to begin podcasting, but they're not sure where to start. They're like, "Oh my gosh, what kind of microphone do I get? What about the background noise? My microphone hears everything. What about the software? This is all. I'm just not going to do anything." It's like if
Oh,
you had
wow.
given an assessment on what sorts of equipment you think would be really helpful for someone getting started with podcasting, what would you recommend?
Okay. Well, I'd say when you're just thinking about podcasting, there are a lot of things you need to do before you even pick up the mic, but maybe we'll talk about those in a bit. But if you have decided to pick up the mic and start a podcast, I would say to you, don't worry about buying lots of equipment, because most of us wander about with a nice phone of some description, that we can record on for the time being. We can uh, we can get cheap or very or free podcast platforms, or platforms to podcast on, and there are some really good apps out there that you can use for recording and editing, and I use Audacity,
Yes.
which is I just adore it. And even though I've been doing this for donkey's years now, still the one I go to. I've tried others, but Audacity is fantastic and it's free. So I would say you can pretty much do podcasting at the beginning for little or nothing. But
Facts.
then if you start getting interested in it, then you start putting together your kit, if you like. And it can get a bit pricey at that point. But hopefully, and this is something you've written about in one of your blogs, I can't remember what it was called, something about poets being a hurdle to poetry, where you
Mhm,
spoke about
mhm,
money, earning money as a
mhm,
poet. I would say to you, when you do decide to go and do some podcasting, for goodness sake, don't make the mistake that I made. At the very beginning, at the very least, put a donation button on your page, because
mm,
that's going to help you with some of the costs, or buy me a coffee, which incidentally Poetry Pea does have. Put that on your podcast webpage, because people are very kind and they will give you a donation if you're offering something of value. That's another thing you need to think about. I went for a very good microphone. I think that's quite important when you start really getting serious about it. I would go for a microphone.
yeah,
I would go, if you're talking about doing a studio quality podcast, I went to Rode,
for
and
sure.
I've got one of their professional microphones. So I
Mhm,
have that for my actual studio, which I'm not in at the moment. Um, and now, because videos and you know on the move recording is so important, I have this piece of kit which is a Sennheiser microphone, which I use for
mhm,
all video recordings.
mhm,
If I'm not using my phone, if I'm out and about, I have two pieces of kit. I have my
mhm,
phone and I have a nice Shure microphone, which really makes a difference when you put it onto your phone. So
mhm,
this is my little Shure microphone. It doesn't come out terribly well with my
mhm,
background,
mhm,
but there you go. So I put that on my phone, and that's great for videos and audio recording. Or I use a Zoom H5, I think it is, for interviews when I'm out and about without any
mm,
video. But to be honest with you, I don't want to be carrying around all that kit. So frankly, if I'm out and about, two pieces of kit is more than enough for me.
mhm,
But as I said, once you start getting serious and start having those pieces of kit you want to wander about with, then you start needing a little bit of money, and buy me a coffee or a PayPal donation button or
mhm.
whatever donation button.
These mics that Patricia's mentioning, these are not cheap mics. Okay, like for instance, this mic here, this is the Shure MV7. This is a USB or XLR mic. Um, it's basically the step below, like when you look at like radio DJs and things like that. A lot of them are using like the SM7B and things like that, that's a $400 microphone, which is often. And the other thing you need to be also considering about for equipment is once you get into the higher level mics, most likely you're going to need an XLR cable. And once you need an XLR cable, you're going to need some sort of you're going to need power. So you're going to need a phantom. It's called like a phantom power source. You can get things like a soundboard that allows you to mix audio, but also provide powers. So, for instance, you can't put it on my camera here. You can get a soundboard like the Roadcaster's, probably one of the more famous ones
Mm,
right now. Honestly, that can carry you for a while. Just something that's kind of like a step above like your phone it's wild the difference in quality that can make. And then as you start, building more and more, you're like you'll probably want to also start looking into other types of microphones as well, like
mm,
Patricia has mentioned. But audio, especially like if you guys are considering doing like a video podcast, kind of like what we do, we take audio from it, but we start with video. Um, Audio is more important. People will tolerate poor video quality if the audio is good. But if the
mhm,
video quality is excellent, 4K, but your audio quality is super short, no
mhm.
one's going to watch your video. No one's going to watch your video. No one's going to listen to you. Guarantee you.
No, it's quite that was a point I was gonna make, you need to be as professional as you possibly can, and the audio
Yes.
in despite the fact that video is becoming important, I mean, that people YouTube is had made a real difference to the number of people coming to my podcast,
Mm.
but the audio is so important, really. And, to go back to the Audacity editing suite,
Hmm.
uh, it also has functionality to make your voice sound much better and louder. So I don't use anything other than Audacity.
Hmm.
Even sort of 6, 7 years on, it has everything I need to make sure that the quality. I mean, I'm not a radio person, so maybe if I was trained as a radio broadcaster, I would do a better job. But people compliment the podcast on its audio
Hmm.
quality, so I'm happy with what we've got.
For sure.
Mm,
I think it's
yeah.
understandable. You mentioned that, so you guys you branched out to YouTube. When did you guys start your YouTube channel specifically?
That's a very good question. I don't actually remember, but I think we must have been doing it for about 3 years now.
Okay. Okay.
So it was people. Some of my listeners had been saying to me, "For goodness' sake, Patricia, put it on YouTube. You put it on YouTube," and I was a bit loath to do that. Uh, just because I didn't know that I had the technical ability to do that. But
Right.
actually, it's very easy, and I should
Hmm.
never have worried about it. Do it immediately. It really makes a difference to whatever podcast platform you're on. It made a huge difference to my
Hmm.
numbers. And of course, as we all know, YouTube is just behind Google, isn't it, for searchability?
Precision.
So it's I think it's vital to have some presence. You don't have to have. Not all my YouTube podcasts have video. I'm able to put them on just audio only, but that doesn't seem to upset people. People will listen to it nonetheless.
Hmm.
So I would do that. And of course, YouTube. I'm not in YouTube's sort of main area. I'm not in the States and I'm
Hmm.
not in the UK. So any developments tend to get over here to Switzerland a bit on the late side. But
Hmm.
I can put podcasts on there now. I can add it to my playlist, and that's another thing I would say, do have playlists so people
Yes.
can, it really helps.
I think it's great that you mentioned YouTube, and it's great you mentioned playlists, because one thing YouTube's done, and I'm sure you've seen this, is YouTube is really trying to enter into the podcast game. So now,
Hmm.
not only can you make a playlist, you can make a podcast playlist.
Hmm.
I don't know what the full integration is. I feel like long term, what YouTube wants to do is they want to make like an RSS version of your podcast, so then it can be found on all the
Hmm.
platforms, Spotify. I don't think we're there just yet,
No.
but this is something that YouTube is already thinking podcasts. YouTube has a dedicated like podcast section. I
Hmm.
think if you just go to youtube.com/podcast, you'll see just different podcasts they have. It's an area that they're getting into. I think it's also really interesting. Last night we did a live stream talking about the Authors Guild did a survey of about 5,000 writers. And one of the things that came up with that was they found that 55 to 65% of authors have no audiobook or audio option for their writing.
Ooh.
And that's so as someone who's very interested in video and audio, I'm like, oh my gosh, this like, and honestly, numbers probably higher than that because that's only the people they surveyed, right? So the
Mhm.
reality is that there is a huge untapped opportunity for audio
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
I think people really need to be considering. And I think one of the reasons, so let's try to give people some greater idea of incentives to get started with audio. Patricia, how comfortable are you talking about numbers? We don't have to go like crazy specific, but in terms of like viewership and things like that.
Well, to be honest with you, I don't know I could give you rough ideas because I
Rough
didn't
numbers are fine. Yeah, rough numbers are
okay,
fine.
because I didn't check them before we came on.
That's fine.
But yeah,
That's fine.
so ask away.
Uh-huh.
If I can tell you, I will.
hmm So one of the things you mentioned, you've mentioned several times, is that when you started YouTube, you noticed
Mhm.
immediately almost an increase in, I'll call it viewership,
Yeah,
audience
yeah,
reach
yeah.
or whatever. Can you give me some like ideas of what are the differences that you saw there?
Well, I mean, at the beginning, I had so I was a much lower grade, not lower grade. I was much lower in the percentage terms, if you like, when I
Mm,
was non YouTube. So I would say I was nowhere near the top 20% of podcasts at that stage. And I can't honestly tell you, I was probably doing maybe 500 um, downloads a month, probably at that stage.
okay.
So at the beginning, it would be very clear. YouTube would be doing a minuscule amount, and my audio would be, as I said, about the 500. And
Okay.
I would say, obviously, both have increased, but I've now got to the stage where YouTube is incredibly important to me. It's,
Mm,
I would say, at least as many YouTube viewers as I get on the audio version, pure
that's
audio
great.
version. So in terms of numbers, so I could be somewhere. I know it sounds terribly small to be such a sort of top 20% podcast, but I'm probably looking at somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 a month downloads
hmm
on
hmm
that, on a very very niche sort of
hmm
poetry type,
hmm
poetry form on that. So that's
hmm
where we are.
hmm
If I'd done this as a business, which I probably should have done, if I hadn't been ill and really been thinking about what I was doing, if I'd started this thinking of it as a long term thing, and I
hmm
believe that anyone who's starting out now should be looking at it as a long term thing,
I agree.
then you should start thinking about monetization pretty much straight away. And as I said, get those donate buttons working for you from the very, very beginning. And also look at, the Patreon type membership. It doesn't have to be Patreon. Buy Me a Coffee does one as well.
hmm
Start doing that relatively quickly, or at least be thinking about it. So have your marketing brain on when you start putting things together, and look at how you can do revenue streams.
Let's imagine that you had. I'll throw you $1,000 to be like, all
With
right, we'll
you?
get started with this.
Okay, well, I'm in Switzerland, so that probably won't go very far. Um, so let's pretend I can afford somebody to do a proper website for me. That's going to be my
Website.
first.
Why
Yeah.
do you pick the website number one?
Why? Because my website could be a lot better. It's a bugbear of my life, and if I could change one thing about my setup, it would be that. And it would also be, and I wouldn't just change the website, but I would have a consultant who would tell me the best way to organize that website.
Mm,
Because
mhm.
you know I'm not the youngest person you're going to be talking to on this show, and I am pre-digital, right? So this was all very new to me,
I
putting a
just want to hold you,
website together.
but I was like, let's go. But not that like I view you as old, but like a lot of people starting podcasts, you're looking at a bunch of like 20-year-olds and stuff like that. I was like, okay, Patricia, look at you. Let's go.
I know I was a bit younger when I started it, but even so, I'm not, didn't grow up in a digital age, so websites was putting a website together was difficult for me. And as I said, I would love to have had someone who would have just said talk to me about the practicalities or I can't remember the technical term, but user friendliness of a
Hmm.
website,
Hmm.
because mine
Gotcha.
could be, it's getting better, uh, but if I had my chance again, I'd do it differently. So, gonna have a better website. I am not going to worry about how I started out, but probably if I could go back and talk to myself and tell my early self, I would do exactly what I've said to you already. I would say, put your business hat on and think about how you can earn some revenue from this, if only to cover the costs, because as you get bigger and better and bolder, you are going to have costs. What I found, and I think this is quite important for somebody thinking starting out, is that the amount of time I now spend on the podcast, it's a full-time job. It's so I am now back to writing in my spare time. And so that might drastically cut down on the amount of time you can spend, particularly if you're podcasting and you've got a full-time job and you're trying to write. I can't imagine having those three things going, because I would something would have to go. And I love doing the podcast and I love writing. Luckily, I don't work other than the podcast. So, but if you do, gosh, it's really going to cut down on the amount of time that you are able to spend creatively. I mean, for
Yes.
yourself, to be published. And let's face it, if we're good at what we do, or if we want to be good at what we do, we have to spend time honing our craft, and then we want to be published at the end of the day, because you need to be published. That's what we're doing it for, if you're serious about what you're doing. And so you have to look for those opportunities. You have to have time to put things together, and you have to start thinking, about putting collections together and things like that. So if you've got that at the back of your mind as well, you have a lot to think about before you ever started. And maybe if you've thrown me a bone and given me some extra bits of money, I would probably start off with a better microphone than just doing it on my phone or whatever. That, because as you've rightly said, the audio quality.
Let's really quick. I know we mentioned it earlier. Distribution. Who are you using to distribute?
Okay, I'm using Red Circle.
Okay. Hmm.
The reason I went, well, again, I would say to someone starting out, think about this for long term, because it doesn't matter who you use. If you need to shift your podcast somewhere else to a different platform, everyone says it's really easy to do, but it's a complete and utter pain. It really is it's horrible. So try and think long term in those terms. And one of the reasons I went to Red Circles, they've got a very good deal. Their support is wonderful. I have to give them 10 out of 10 for support, because as we've discovered, technology is not my friend, so I often need to use them. And they're very good, very quick, and I have no problems with distribution. They helped me tremendously when I moved from SoundCloud to them. And the another reason I started with them was they made it really easy if you want to go down the channel route. So, podcast channeling, which I will be doing,
Hmm.
it's very easy to use them and use their facilities to do that. So I think it's quite important to find a podcast platform that you feel you can work with, but one that will work with you long term. If
Hmm.
you do become, get lots of downloads and you start to build up other podcasts on the back of that, think about that too.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you know, like, so, and we should have mentioned this. So when you sign up for a podcast, you need a distribution platform, because basically the distribution platform is what takes your podcast and puts it everywhere, like
Hmm.
your Google Podcast, your Apple Music, your Spotify, things like that. Do you know, for your guys' podcast, which specific platform do you see the greatest viewership on? Is it Spotify? I'm guessing it's Apple Music, but where do you guys see the most?
Yeah, it's definitely Apple. Definitely, no question. Spotify, I'm really shouldn't say this out loud, should I? Spotify is a little bit disappointing, but
I know I would, yes. I would, not that like we're crushing it in views because we are very, very young, but yeah, Spotify I thought would do better, but
mhm.
I'm thinking people don't turn to Spotify for podcasts. I think they turn to it for music.
I wonder if you are a Spotify person, podcast, you're automatically going to rate higher up the algorithms than somebody who's coming in from another distributor. I
Mm,
imagine. I mean, I don't know for sure. I haven't done the research yet, but I do wonder if that's the case.
mhm.
That's why I'm not seeing as many downloads from Spotify as
That's
I
a
would
good
have
theory.
expected.
Mhm.
But things are always changing. The algorithms. It's hard to keep up. But I wanted to say, if you do decide to go ahead and podcast, as we discussed, be as professional as you can. Do your best with your audio. And something we perhaps didn't talk about is think about your uniqueness, your unique selling point. It could be your personality, it could be what you're talking about.
I'm glad that you brought up personality versus topic. It's really, really hard to build on personality. It's really hard because like that's not to say that like people aren't like we're not like engaging in things like that, but it's just to have someone tune into you just for you,
Mm,
especially if no one knows you,
yeah.
it's really hard to give that value to people. But niching, so choosing a specific area, so like you pick something super like Japanese short form. That's cool. So I would say, I think for us, a lot of times we're aiming more towards like the professional poetry side. That's
Hmm.
kind of what we're targeting. We
Hmm.
do craft stuff as well, but it's really about thinking about writing in business, because there's just not a whole lot of content out about that. So that's
Hmm.
kind of our niche. So that's something I really would encourage. Don't you? I think just being like, I'm going to do a poetry podcast. I would really encourage you to kind of just take a minute to think
Oh
and be
yeah.
like, okay, that's cool. I like it. It might not be enough. You
Yeah.
might need to go, whether it's like choosing a form, choosing an aspect of like a style, a craft point, something.
Yeah.
Um, it can even be like maybe the region, just maybe focusing on poetry from the city where you live in or something like just something. This is really going to help people find you a lot more than keeping it
Yeah.
too general. I really can't emphasize that enough.
No, I would totally agree with you. I mean, that's exactly where I found myself at the beginning. We've just said, I'm in Switzerland. Most of my audiences are in English speaking lands, and you know, how do I find them? And that's another thing that you should be asking yourself.
Yeah.
Am I unique? How am I going to find
Mhm.
the people who are going to listen to me? How am I going to communicate with them? And that's where
Yeah.
social media comes in, and that's a whole other ball game.